a follow-up question. You know, the Republicans who are running for governor are saying we're going to cut taxes. How are you going to counteract that, and what are you going to do when you're dealing with a big tax and spend liberal?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a couple of things. The first I think we do is say, look around. You know, is this the Minnesota that you want after 10 years of this kind of governance philosophy? And I think most Minnesotans are going to say, no, that's not what we want to do. I also think we say, this is not no taxes, no new taxes. This is pushing money down, not just to property taxes, but also a tax on the most vulnerable people, because when people lose their services, the most vulnerable people in Minnesota, that's like raising their taxes on them, because they're going to have to find the money out of their own pockets to pay for that kind of coverage. And so I think that in those are two of the ways we address that. And the last thing I think we have to do is say, it's not just about taxes or no taxes, it's about what we're going to do with the money. And one of the strengths I think I can bring to this campaign is a record of actually delivering services more effectively, streamlining things, doing things in smarter and better ways, so that we can actually provide those services with the resources we have. And so it's all of those things together.
Thank you.
Go on next, speaker is Paul.
I'm Paul Thissen. I'm a farmer and farm organizer from southwestern Minnesota. Racism is present through all regions of Minnesota, including rural Minnesota. Immigrants working on large-scale factory farms and the food processing industry face constant discrimination. This issue stuck really home a couple years ago when I was present in the Higher Ed Committee, in which the DREAM Act was under consideration. It was beyond belief to see the hatred in the eyes of people testifying against the opportunity for children to have financial aid to go to college. The hatred was because the children being discussed were sons and daughters of immigrants. As I sat there that day, I couldn't help but remember a story my mom told me years ago when she was a nurse in World War II, when she was in the South and she was riding on a bus having a delightful conversation with a young black girl, and they were asked to go to the back of the bus. And she said no that day, and that story stuck with me. It talked to me about the value of human life and about standing up. So what will you do as a candidate for governor to step away from tapping people's fear and playing on the divisions in our community on race? And what is your plan in talking about race to build community and hope?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. Thank you for sharing that story too, because I think it's very powerful. I support the DREAM Act first of all, and think it's important. I think one of the things we have to do on this issue of immigration, first of all, and race, is we have to separate out the number of who's coming in and coming out of our country from the question of what we do when people are here and they're members of our community. And that's the role of the governor and the role of the state. And we need to make sure that they can lead as productive and healthy lives as possible. You know, I think that there's many ways to get at this issue. You know, of course we have to pass good, smart laws about racial discrimination, about health disparities, something I've worked on a lot at the state capitol, about the achievement gap. And we have to enforce those laws. But I think that there's a more fundamental thing here, and the fact of the matter is we have to acknowledge up front that Minnesota is a very different place today than it was 25 years ago. You know, when I was growing up here, I grew up in Bloomington and went to, you know, when I was going to school and in my church, it was the rare exception that there was a person of color, a person of any difference from me. I went to a Catholic school too, so even the religion thing was that way. And I think, you know, we have to understand that people are coming from that place, and we have to meet them at that level. And so, you know, as I went off to college, I had a roommate who was Jewish, and it was getting close to the holiday season. I was on my stereo playing a lot of Christmas music. And finally, after a couple hours, he stopped me and said, you know, I think we've had enough of that. It had never dawned on me, right, that this was a problem. And it's really about opening people's eyes. And to do that, you have to engage in honest and frank discussion and start where people are. Now, what's hopeful, I think, is that my own kids, you know, go to the Minneapolis public schools, and they, you know, go to the Pride Parade as an example, and it doesn't even faze them because they have kids in their class who have 2 moms and 2 dads, and they sit next to people who speak Spanish as a first language at home. And I think that kind of is a model for all of us. But what it really is to challenge ourselves and have a governor who is going to challenge all of us, first of all, to acknowledge that we all have failings in this regard, and that we all come from a place where we carry with us kind of in our hearts as well as our heads some things that we have to overcome and see things in different ways. And by acknowledging that up front, I think we can actually have the conversation that we need to have to address these issues in a constructive way.
I would like to offer a follow-up question. I believe that there are racial disparities in many places. So my question to you is, do you believe that there are racial disparities within our schools, that there are racial disparities within the healthcare, employment, and the criminal justice system, and how would you as governor address those racial disparities to close that gap?
Yeah, well, I don't just believe that there are, I know that there are. I don't think that there's any dispute that that's the case. And the way that you do that is, again, first of all, acknowledging that that problem exists, and then having a dialogue about how you kind of get after that. So in health disparities, as part of our health reform, we have been paying a lot of attention to that issue and trying to figure out how we address that issue, not just from a racial perspective, from a socioeconomic perspective. And there are cultural things that we can do to improve that. From an education perspective, we know that if we were to extend the school year, as an example, and get into communities and give hope to people in their communities by things like the DREAM Act, so that people have a pathway to go forward, that we can build that hope so that we can close that achievement gap. So I think it's passing good, smart public policy, but it's also acknowledging up front that these things do exist and that we have problems. And sometimes Minnesotans like to gloss that over and ignore it. So the first thing is to kind of acknowledge it up front.